friends, it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using Hello Bluebird's Fairy Dance, Fairy Garden, and Strawberry Patch stamp sets. So I've stamped the images out on Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock with Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink. And I'm going to be coloring with my Copic markers to match some pattern paper from the Pebbles Cool Girl 6x8 pad. So I'll tear out the sheet that I'm going to use as my color inspiration and tuck that under my cardstock panel. So I'm going to start with my fairy, and I'm going to give her a pale Caucasian skin tone, something similar to my own. And I'm going to use E000, E00, and E11. Starting with the E11 for some shadows, I'm going to place those up under her hairline, down the side of her face, and on the underside of her arms, the back of her legs, and up under her little skirt. And then I'll start to blend that out with the E00. I'll save some room for a nice highlight on the center of her face and on her hands and feet with that E000. And while I have these markers out, I'm also going to use them for the bases of my two little mushrooms. So I'm using the E11 up under the cap for a shadow, and then blending down toward the bottom where it would catch the most light. Then I'm going to bring in R11 and R20 to give my fairy girl some rosy cheeks. And while I'm doing that, I'll also do the ladybugs as well. You can add rosy cheeks before you do the other coloring or after. It really doesn't make too much of a difference. And then I'm going to move on to her hair, and I'm going to go blonde because I want it to match the yellows in the pattern paper. But I'm doing a blonde combo that I've never done before. I wanted something that was a little bit brighter than what I usually go for, just because I wanted to match the pattern paper. So I'm using Y06, Y21, YR21, and YR23. And I do hair a little bit different than I do most everything else. I actually start with my lightest shade and lay in where my darkest is going to eventually go. And so I started with my Y06 and kind of mapped out where those shadows would eventually be, which is in the crease between where her bun meets the top of her head, and then also on the edges of her bangs and the sides of her hair at the root where it's kind of pulled up toward that bun. And then I'm blending out with the Y21, then the YR21, and I'm trying to leave some little highlighted areas in there, which I will go over at the very end once again with the Y06. Now this was looking a little bit too bright for me. It was a good match for that pattern paper, but I do like my images to be a bit more realistic if possible. I mean, we are talking about fairies here, but I just wanted the color tone to be just a little bit richer and deeper. So I did go back in with an extra layer of that YR23 and the YR21 to kind of mute it a little bit. I still wanted the highlights to be that bright yellow, but I just wanted there to be a little bit more depth. And so I also added in one shade darker with the E35. The E35 is a really rich kind of golden brown tone, so I thought it would go well with those yellows. So I'm going to leave it at that and move on to my little ladybug. So for her face, I'm using T1, T3, and T5 with the highlight on the upturned part of her face. And then for her body, I'm going to use R20, R22, and R24. So there are some ladybugs in that pattern paper. You can kind of see one at the very top of the screen there, and it is a little bit lighter than the strawberries in the pattern paper. So that's where I took my cue and tried to match that as best as I could. And then I went back to my T5 to add those spots back in, just a little dab of that. Then I'm going to switch to a bit of a darker red for those strawberries. I'm going to keep the R22 and R24, but I'm going to add in the R29. So I'll lay in a little bit of a shadow with that on each of those strawberries, and I'm just adding this shadow based on the direction that the strawberry is kind of turned. And I'm coloring right over the little seeds because they're so hard to color around, and I have so many images in this little layout here that I just didn't want to take the time to try to color around them. So I'll go back and fix those in a little bit, but for now I'm just coloring right over them. So I'm blending out that R29 with the R24, and then I'm going to fill in the highlighted area with the R22 until they all look nice and juicy. For the strawberry stems and leaves, I'm going to go for the darker green leaf in that pattern paper. So I pulled out G14, G16, and G19. That darker green is a bit more of a blue toned green, so that's why I went for this combo. So I'm starting with the G19 and laying that in on the stems, kind of up under the leaves where they would be casting a bit of a shadow, and also on the center of the leaves where the little line is drawn to give the leaves a bit of a crease. Then I'll blend that out with the G16, and then I'll use the G14 for the highlight. And because this is a larger vine, I'm just working around in sections. So I'm just doing like the bottom part first, and then I'll move on and color the rest. So while I'm doing that, I did just want to mention that this video is a part 2 of my previous video, which was a plan a card with me. So for the month of April, we started out with having no ideas whatsoever, but I did know that I wanted to use some of my brand new pattern papers. So I went with the print that I was most excited to use and then based the entire card design off of that. That was my jumping off point for choosing the stamp sets that I would use, for the die I would use, for the background color palette, for the colored cardstock that I'm going to use, the distress inks that I'm going to use for the background. All of that was based off of this one sheet of pattern paper. So if you're interested to see how I come up with card ideas and kind of what goes through my mind as I'm designing a new concept for a card, I do have that video that you can check out, and I actually have an entire playlist on my channel because I've started to do these plan a card with me videos once a month now. So if that sounds interesting to you, definitely check that playlist out. Each of the videos is a two-parter, so the first part is coming up with the new idea, and then the second part is the completion of the card. So I've moved on to a new green combo, and this time I'm taking from the brighter, more yellow-green leaves that are in that pattern paper. So I went with YG03, YG05, and YG07. So I'm going to do all of the leaves in this cluster with the bluebells here, starting with the YG07 for the darkest at the base of each leaf and at the curves of the stem where I think it would be in more shadow. And then I am blending that out with the YG05 and then using the YG03 on the top edge of each of those leaves and on the part of the stem that I think the sun would be hitting the most. And I'm also going to do the little plant with the trio of flowers over in the bottom left with this same combo. So just placing those colors in the exact same way. And then there is one more combo of green leaves in that pattern paper. It doesn't appear quite as often, but it is a really pale blue-green. So I'm using G00, G02, and G03 for that, and I'm just doing this tiny little leaf cluster. So I place the G03 closest to the base and the lightest shade at the edges, just like I did with all of the other leaves. And then I'm moving on to my little bluebells, and I wanted these to match the background of that pattern paper. So I pulled out BV01, BV02, and BV04. So I'm putting the BV04 at the very top and then blending out with the BV02. There is a bit of difference between these two, so they don't blend super great, but I will fix that in a minute. I don't want to oversaturate the paper, so I'm just blending out the highlighted area with the BV01 at the bottoms, and then adding a touch of the BV04, and then blending out with the BV02 for the opposite side of those bluebells. And then to blend out the BV04 and BV02, once again, I just did a little tip-to-tip action with those darkest two shades. So then I'm going to move on to the aqua blue in that pattern paper, and I'm using BG11 and BG13, and I'm going to do the two flowers that are next to the bluebells. I did decide that I wanted a third shade in there, so I brought in BG10, and then I am going to use the BG10 to color in my fairy wings. And I just placed that color darkest toward the body of my fairy and then left the tiniest bit of white space at the edges of the wings so they would look a little bit softer. Then I'm going to bring out that soft purple that is kind of clustered in there. This combo is just a little bit darker than the pattern paper, but I think that's all right. So I used V00, V01, and V04. This is the closest that I could get with the Copics that I own, and I placed the darkest color toward the center and the lightest toward the edges of the petals. The next combo I'm going for is the flowers that have like the pink petals and then the yellow center, and I decided to use R30, R32, and R35 for that. So I've got the R35 toward the center and then blended out with the R32 and then the R30 on the tips. Next, I was going to attempt to recreate those white flowers that turn to yellow and then red in the center. This was a bit of a fail. It just didn't quite work out. Not everything that works on pattern paper translates well in marker form, but I thought I would leave it in the video just to show you. So I did use the E40 for the white parts, and then I brought in Y06. It wasn't bright enough, so I decided to darken it up with Y35. And then it just like didn't have enough dimension compared to how I'd colored the other images, so I brought in Y38. But ultimately I just decided that it didn't really resemble that flower very much. I did do the center with R22, but I just didn't like it. I didn't think it translated well, so I decided to just take a light yellow marker. I used Y02 and just blended out the edge of the petals with that, and then the coloring was similar to what I'd done with the other flowers. So then I'm going to go back to those E40s though to bring in that softer kind of creamy white shade, and I'm going to do my mushroom caps. So I went with E40, E41, and E42, using the E42 for some shadow on the lower right, and then blended out with the E41, and then use the E40 for the highlight. Then for the fairy's dress, I decided to go for that large kind of cool toned pink flower down at the bottom edge there. I pulled in RV10, RV11, and RV13. So I just used a little RV13 for the shadow, blended out with the RV11, and used the RV10 for a highlight. I did do a second layer of that off screen. I used the T5 for the centers of the purple flowers, since they are black centers on that pattern paper. And then I grabbed a white Sakura jelly roll pen to add my white seeds back to my strawberries. So I'm just adding a tiny little line in the center of where those seeds are drawn so that they look white again. So I'm just working my way carefully around each of those and just trying to place it as close to the center of that drawn little line as I can. And I think that works well. I think it's probably a lot easier than trying to color around all of those little seeds. And now I'll trim these images out with their matching dies. For my focal panel, I'm going to take a piece of Bristol smooth surface cardstock and trim out an oval shape using the Hello Bluebird nesting ovals. And then I am going to paint a simple watercolor background on this panel using some Distress Oxide inks. I'm using Salvage Patina for the sky, and I'm trying to do it very messily. I like to have little areas that are a bit darker and little areas that are lighter and little flecks and things here. I am staying away from the edge and just leaving a little bit of a white border. And then I'm going to switch to some Twisted Citron to do the grass down at the bottom. And most of this is going to be covered up by my images, so I knew I didn't have to be too particular with it. I did mix the two shades a bit as well to get a kind of third shade of green that would match the darker leaves in that pattern paper. And so I'm just going to paint that until I'm happy with the look that I've got, and then I will set this panel aside to dry completely. Once it has, I will pop it in my MISTI so I can stamp my sentiment. I'm doing Have a Magical Day, and I'm stamping that in VersaFine Onyx Black ink. I'm going to stamp it down twice since it is quite a delicate font, and so I want to make sure it's very legible. And then I'm going to stamp on the inside of my card as well. I'm using Lawn Fawn Guava cardstock and the matching guava ink. Because these are the same color, I am going to have to stamp that down several times to make sure that I have a dark enough impression to show up, because this ink does dry back a little bit. But I was going for something that was a little bit more subtle for today. So I just did a fairy, a butterfly, and You Sparkle. Then I went back to my Pebbles Cool Girl 6x8 pad and chose another print of pattern paper to match with the original inspiration print. First, I wasn't sure if I wanted to do that because I love that print so much. I didn't know if I wanted to cover up any of it, but ultimately I decided that I like a bit of contrast in my prints. And so I decided to go for the main print to cover the entire card base, and it is an A2 standard size card, so 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and then a thinner strip going vertically from the top to the bottom with that pink kind of gingham print. Then I added my focal panel, popped up on some foam tape, just made sure that that was centered on the card before I pressed it down into place. And then I will bring in my images. I'm going to start with the strawberries and the bluebells because I knew that I wanted these two to create an arch. And so I just needed to figure out how I wanted them to overlap at the top of the scene. And then once I decided on that, I could begin to adhere those down. So I'm starting with the bluebells, and those are going to get tucked underneath the strawberries. So I'm using those strawberries as a placeholder to figure out exactly where I want those bluebells to be adhered. And then I am going to grab just a tiny bit of foam tape because some of those images are going to hang off the focal panel a bit, and I wanted to make sure that they would be supported. So I have just a little bit of foam tape where needed, but the rest I will adhere with liquid glue so that everything is on one level of dimension, so it will be much easier to mail. So I'm just arranging those strawberries where I want those to go. And then you can see that the strawberry plant is just up a slight bit higher than the bluebells. So to cover that up, I'm going to add the lilac looking flowers down below the strawberries. And then I'll add the mushrooms down below the bluebells Just trying to add a bit of extra dimension and depth into this little scene. I'm going to use my fairy and my ladybug as placeholders once again to make sure that I have everything where I want it so I can figure out the last couple of images here. I'm going to add the yellow flower down near the mushrooms, and then the pink flower and that extra little leaf cluster I'll add over on the left hand side. And then I can adhere my fairy, just making sure that those are just where I want them because this glue does dry very quickly. So if there's any adjustments needed, I have to make them quickly. So I'll add my fairy, and then before I press her down really firmly, I'll add the ladybug, and I want to make it look like they're holding hands. So I'm just going to press them together there, and then I can push them down firmly so that they adhere. As a finishing touch, I did want to add just a little bit of sparkle, especially since we've got a fairy card. So I'm doing a couple of clear sequins. I did 3 at the top left and 2 at the bottom right. I let those dry for about a minute, and then I'm going to fill the centers with some stardust stickles for even more sparkle. I'll also add that to coat the fairy wings completely, so those are nice and glittery. And I will also add it just a few little dabs here and there to the centers of my flowers, and I'll do a few little streaks on my bluebells and a little bit on the blue flowers as well, just so all of the flowers have a little bit of sparkle to them. And that is going to finish this one off, so I will lift it up to the camera so you can see all of the detail and catch some of that shimmer from the sparkle and shine. I'll also give you another peek at the inside. I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. I'm super pleased with how it turned out. I do think that the design embellished that pattern paper to the best that I could and really brought it to life, and I hope that you feel that way too. If you did, please be sure to hit the like button and leave me a comment down below. I love to hear from you. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell if you want to be alerted whenever I post new videos. All of the products I use will be listed and linked for you in the description bar below, and if you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 extra videos I thought you might also enjoy. You can click on either one to check them out. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I hope you had a good one, and I'll see you soon in another video. Bye-bye!